Hello everybody and welcome to NQA's webinar on the migration of 18001 to ISO 45001 management system. My name is Terry Fisher. I'm the Principal Assessor for NQA. Hopefully you'll find this morning's webinar useful. If you've got any questions as we go through, by all means type them into the chat box and I'll try and answer them as we go, and there'll also be a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So, the migration of 18001 to 45001 commenced when the revised standard 45001 was published back in 2018. Seems a long time ago now. Doesn't time fly? And hopefully you're all managing to keep safe and well, and you're using your management system within your organizations. And now more than ever, it's really important to use the structure of the management system to protect workers and people generally. So this is where really the management system should be fully utilised at every opportunity within your business. Just a little bit about NQA. As you know, we're a global certification body. We've got operations throughout the world. Over 1,000 employees worldwide. We do 100% inclusive fees within the UK. We operate in over 90 countries. And we have 1,000 certificates out there in the marketplace commercially over a global footprint. We work with some high-profile clients and smaller clients, but all in clients are important. We don't charge travel expenses within the UK. We have no hidden costs and certification fees within our processes. We don't increase audit time for transitions and migrations unless that's a mandatory requirement. And there is a mandatory requirement within 45001 to cover things like leadership and context, which are new requirements. We don't require mandatory gap analysis unless it's part of a technical requirement coming from the global industry. We hope to deliver a transparent and excellent service. We hope to provide support to all our clients, regardless of size and nature of operation. We really are here to help organisations. I've just received one comment about they're not receiving audio. Can someone else confirm that audio is working? Hello? Yeah, it appears that the sound is working from my end. I've had confirmation from a couple of listeners, so it would appear everything's okay from my end. So it may be a problem for yourself. Right. So as we go through the webinar, as I've said, if you do have any questions, by all means, type them into the box and I'll try and answer them as we go. Right. A copy of the slides and the recording of the presentation will be sent to all registrants at the end of the webinar, and the recordings will be available via NQA's website. So I've already had one question about the migration date for 18,001 to 45, and I'll clarify that now, seeing as it has recently changed. It's actually changed earlier this week on a global basis. The migration deadline has been extended due to the COVID-19 outbreak, etc. So just to clarify there, the migration deadline now is the 30th of September 2021. So there has been a 6 month, just over 6 month extension to the migration deadline. And basically at that point, 18,001 will be withdrawn as a OHS standard. So why implement 45,001? What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to enhance occupational health and safety performance and standards within organisations. We're looking to improve and engage with workers, and worker engagement is a critical factor within the management standard. It hopes to develop risk-based thinking in line with the organisation's operational needs and requirements. So it's about integrating OHS into the thinking and the way an organisation functions, not just we make a number of widgets and we do a bit of health and safety. It's actually trying to integrate that into the way the organisation works. So it's a culture change for an organisation. We're looking to achieve proactive risk management. And yes, there is an element of reactive risk management because we can't foresee everything, as I think recent events has demonstrated. However, where possible, we'll use a systematic approach to be proactive in our risk management to reduce culpability and primarily protect workers and people. It also helps leadership in terms of a structured management approach. It can demonstrate and control actions and improvements, and it can be a public demonstration of commitment, both outside the organisation and within, because it should be about the engagement of the whole organisation, not just at a senior leadership level. So that's what we're trying to deliver. As most of you will be aware, ISO 45001 is based on a revised structure that's been used within recently revised management standards for 9014, 27001. So it's used across the whole management standard remit, and the management structure is referred to as Annex SL. This was introduced by ISO as a means of standardizing the structure of management systems, which, to be fair, I think has been really effective and helps make the integration of management systems far easier for people. So that management structure is based on I'll call them chapters for ease of reference. The first three that we're looking at here, scope and the normative references and the terms and definitions, are talking about the ISO standard itself. So what the standard is trying to deliver, what it's trying to achieve. The normative references that it refers to within the standard, and the terms and definitions used within the standard. The one that's quite useful actually is both the scope of the management standard, and this is the ISO standard. This is not your own individual organization scope, But it's interesting to look at that to understand what the management structure is trying to deliver. But it's also very useful to understand the terms and definitions, because there's been some revision to terms and definitions, and we'll go through those as we work through. However, it's quite useful there to have that within the management standard, the terms and definitions used. So the bits that we're actually interested in from an assessment and an organisational point of view, so any audits are looking at chapters 4 to 10 inclusively. So this is the main body of the standard. These are the requirements and the clause requirements of the standard itself. And then it goes through that. And this is, like I say, these are the same titles. The content is different for various disciplines, but the basic structure and titles within the chapter headings is the same throughout 9,000, 14,000, 45,000. So it should give you some commonality looking at how management systems and structures work across a range of organisations. So there they are: context of organisation, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation and improvement. We'll go into more detail about those as we go. So if everybody's happy with that, has anybody got any questions in relation to? Doesn't appear to be any questions. Excellent. Right. So I'll bring these out in one hit rather than bringing them out in a phased approach. So as we said at the start, one of the primary thing about the management system and what it's trying to achieve is cultural change and improvement of OHS performance within the organisation and protecting of workers and people. I use the term workers deliberately rather than just staff and employees, because workers, depending on your organisation, needs to include contractors, agency members, etc., etc. So some organisations have very few employees but a high number of contractors or subcontractors. So it depends on the nature of the organisation. So we deliberately use the term workers in the management standard and assessments as an all-encompassing phrase. So section 4, the context of the organisation, is the organisation looking at itself and trying to understand what's the internal issues, the external issues, what pushes and pulls the organisation to be what it is, what things does it need to comply with, what's it trying to achieve, etc. So it's an inward looking thing to first of all understand what the organisation is about and where it currently is. And that will generate internal and external issues and things that you need to consider, and interested parties. So it's the activities and the purpose of the organisation. Then the other element to section 4 is the interested parties. So the primary interested parties within the section 4 are workers, because they're the primary protection group, and that includes workers at all levels, whether you be an MD or whoever within an organisation. It's an all-encompassing term. But interested parties can also include legal enforcement agencies, regulatory agencies, commercial considerations, group considerations, unions, etc., etc., etc. So there's a whole range and myriad of interested parties that may be impacted and interested in the organisation and what it does and how it functions and how it performs. Section 5 of the management standard looks at leadership. So it's about the strategy, the policy, the roles and responsibility of the organisation, and the participation of those workers at all levels to have some input and have some influence as appropriate within the management system and its operation. To achieve an effective management system, you've got to have participation at all levels within an organisation to make it really effective and really deliver benefit, which is what we're trying to aim for. Section 6 looks at hazard identification, risk management, compliance obligations, or legal and other requirements as the standard uses. I've used compliance here because both terms are interchangeable as far as the standard goes. Compliance obligations is used in 14,001 and 9,001, and so I've used that there. But you can, what you call something isn't that critical. It's the function of the activity that we're primarily interested in. So for compliance obligations, interpret that as legal and other requirements in terms of the standard terminology. And also OHS objectives. So all the planning elements of the management structure. Sections 7 and 8, really important, resources, competence, awareness. So it's no good expecting somebody to do something if they don't know that they're expected to do it. So it's about that communication and participation as well as awareness, communication, and documented information. So documented information is an all-encompassing term which we'll explain further as we go through the webinar. Also in sections 7 and 8, so section 7 is the support section and section 8 is the operational control elements. So the hierarchy of control, change management, which I think is really meaningful at the moment. Procurement is there as a leading element within the operational control because it also includes contractor control and various things like that, because procurement process generally is where you've got the primary engagement with your contractors, what you're engaging them for, are they competent, etc. So that it's a really important element to look and consider how it actually works within your organisation. And last but not least, emergency preparedness within the OHS framework, which obviously I'm sure many organisations currently will have looked at their emergency preparedness, and there may have been some shortcomings there because we can't always foresee every eventuality, and we may have had to make some quite swift and significant changes to operations currently. Sections 9 and 10 cover the evaluation and improvement elements, so looking at internal audit, management review, incident information, investigations and corrective actions, improvement objectives and how that's actually performing, and the improvement process, how do you monitor and understand what's going on within the organisation as opposed to an ideological view of, oh, well, everything's okay. So the management system generates information, and your whole of your organisation will be generating information that can be indicators to the improvement process and performance information that you may need to monitor and review. So that's a very quick overview of the management system in its entirety. So firstly, when you're looking at your management system for OHS, you need to consider and have some understanding of what the business is, what the business is trying to do, which direction the business is going, and it needs some leadership commitment to look at why you're implementing the management system, what's the strategic direction of the organisation, the policy and the various things that need to be considered. You need to also understand the workers and other interested parties that may be relevant to the OHS performance. So it can include unions, as I say, enforcement agencies. All that helps to identify the context of the organisation and what it's about. And then you can define, when you understand those three things, you can then define the scope of applicability of the OHS management system. So that's the structured approach of defining your own scope and the applicability of the management system throughout the organisation. Just at one point there, to be registered against 45,001, all clause requirements are applicable. There are no exclusions or exemptions to any clauses within 45,001. So you can't limit applicability or exclude various clauses. Everyone for a registered system is applicable. So when we're looking at the context of the organisation, this is the new element really that wasn't captured within 18,001. So the context is, think about the different contexts of the following types of organisation. I've given you some examples here: a water company, a university, a food manufacturer, a family-owned engineering company. All have different contexts, different things. Even one water company in comparison to another water company can have different requirements depending on where it's based, its customer base, etc. All these things have an influence on how an organisation performs and what an organisation is expected to do and how it needs to deliver those requirements. So these are what basically the context is trying to withdraw from an organisation and get to understand. Because if you don't understand what the organisation has to deliver, then it can be difficult to then deliver that, and it can be difficult to understand the safety implications of trying to deliver that as far as an organisation. And it isn't just about commercial considerations. Charities, etc., are not as commercial as other organisations, but they still have requirements that they need to meet. They still need to do things in a particular way, etc. And that can all be defined and needs to be understood because it influences the way the management system and the organisation actually functions in the real world. So this isn't about some, fantasy text on something that isn't real. This is about real, everyday protection of workers in their normal working environment and the requirements of that operation. So if we go into clause 4 in a little bit more detail, so understanding the organisation, its context, what does the organisation do and why does it do it? Understanding the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. As I said, workers, a primary term used within the management standards, an all-encompassing term, not just staff and employees. And interested parties are both internal and external in terms of people that have an interest, have a right. It's quite reasonable for them to have an interest and a need to know, maybe just information that they need, but it may be they actually want to participate in terms of, let's say, unions, for example. So all these things need to be considered and they need to be understood and they need to be practically applied within the management system. The context of the organisation is a really key driver of the management system, and it's subject to, potentially regular and frequent change. The current situation with the virus, etc., is a demonstration of all of a sudden the needs and expectations have changed significantly in a short period of time. So organisations and the context can change quite radically. It's quite a dynamic activity, and the management system is there to identify that change and then take you through a systematic approach to understand, right, what do we need to do? Why do we need to do that? Who's interested in it? How do we need to deliver that improvement? So that's what the context is really all about. And it's quite like I say, it's a really dynamic activity. And once you understand those two things, then you can determine the scope of the management system. The scope of the management system needs to be documented within your organisation. So we'll need to see some evidence of that within. So it might be, you know, applicable to all operations, etc., etc. You need to define the scope of applicability within your organisation. Then there's the management system general requirements, which is there understanding how things work, what's the processes, how do things come into the business, how do you actually operate, and understanding that relationship within the context of the organisation in relation to the OHS system. Companies use various models of identifying the various aspects of internal and external factors, and here are a couple of models that can be used. The management standard doesn't define how you do this, but it says you must understand that and be able to demonstrate that to us in terms of as assessment bodies, certification bodies. So a lot of organisations use PESTEL and different cultural skills and various models for identifying the various aspects and elements of internal and external factors that can be an influence. And they will all be unique to an individual organisation. Although an organisation may be doing exactly the same thing as another organisation, I guarantee you every organisation is unique in some aspect because of whether it be resources, strategy, management style, where the existing culture, etc., etc. So it's really important that you consider that, because they all have an influence in the effectiveness of the management system going forward. As I've said earlier, workers are the primary interested party, and we include workers at all levels for that within 45001. So although the terminology has changed with 45001, I think it's always been the case that 18001 was there to protect people and workers. So I think it's just some terminology there, but it takes, the 45001 takes it further and looks at, well, so what's the relationship between what do they need, how do you meet that, etc. It's looking at understanding that in terms of effective application of the management system. So you can see I've used that example there, looking at an overview of, for example, an IMS including 9001, which is quality, and 14001, which is environmental management. You can see the commonality there, using the same structure of interested parties. How it's really useful to know who those interested parties are, what their needs are, how, and as the critical point there is, how then do you deliver that need as an organisation? What do you do to do that? How do you know it works, etc. So all these things are really important in terms of the management system and its standards. The scope of the management system, you need to define the boundaries and applicability of the management system, and it can only be done once you've looked at the context and the workers and the interested parties. Within Annex SL and the revised management standards, and certainly within 45001, this requirement of leadership has been enhanced. So it's not just about management. So it isn't, oh, well, I've told them what to do, so therefore, you know. It's about enhancing that participation engagement with workers and operations and various things to ensure that what you think is going on, what you're doing is actually delivering a safe and healthy working environment for people. So in clause 5, it looks at leadership and worker participation, what you do, what are the methodologies, communications, etc., looking at all of that. And it talks about leadership and commitment. As with all management standards, it requires a documented policy, and it requires particular requirements there that should be contained within that policy. The whole of the management system after this point is about delivering the policy commitment. So everything you do within your management system is there to deliver that policy commitment. That policy commitment needs to be documented, and it needs to be communicated, and it needs to be available for both assessment and to relevant interested parties. And within that, it needs to have a commitment to a safe and healthy working conditions and prevention of work-related injury and ill health. So it's not just about accidents and physical injury. It is talking about worker ill health, so people's overall well-being in an occupational framework, not just the cut fingers and the physical accidents, but stress, ergonomics, longer term chronic exposures, etc., which has always been part of OHS. It's nothing fundamentally new there, but it just reinforces that in relation to injury and ill health. Organisational roles and responsibilities and authorities. The phrase accountabilities have been dropped from the title. People can't transfer accountability. They can give other people responsibilities and authorities to perform certain things, but you can't delegate accountability. This is a top leadership requirement, that they are accountable for the performance of the management system. Organisational roles and responsibilities and authorities need to be available as documented information. That can take many forms, so organisational charts, job descriptions, etc., etc. People need to understand how they fit in to an organisation, what are their key requirements of their role, etc. What are they expected? What responsibility, what levels of authority have they got? In terms of consultation and participation, which is a key element of the management standard, the whole organisation should be looking at mechanisms and removal of barriers to aid communication at all levels and make that communication transparent and effective. Looking at time and resources, so it isn't just talking about, oh, I've told them what to do, but they need time and resources and maybe training and information to help them deliver that requirement. It talks about non-manager participation to identify hazards and controls and the establishment of various elements of the system up to and including the policy. So it's not saying that every worker should have an individual right to veto the policy, but there should be a mechanism there to say, can we communicate? Does anybody have any issues with that, etc. And depending on your own organisation, it's about this participation, because when workers and individuals are involved in a process, they're more likely to work with it, and it's more likely to be far more effective in the long term. So it's all about that culture of engagement at all levels within the management system. And they should be involved in the hazards and the controls, hazard identification controls and various things and suggestions and whatever. Like I say, it leads to a really meaningful management system in terms of OHS performance. Planning and looking at hazards and risk reduction. The hierarchy of controls is the framework in which to work there in terms of, you know, if you identify a hazard, the primary thing to do, the most effective thing to do is where possible, eliminate that hazard, then work down that hierarchy, looking at substitution. So, you know, reduce the hazard by substituting it for a different type of material or process or chemical or activity or whatever. So substitution to eliminate or reduce that risk. Engineering controls, so isolating people from a particularly hazardous area or hazardous operation or whatever, guarding, etc. They're all elements of engineering controls. Administrative controls are the work instructions and the information, so people understand the way you want them to work and why, and as importantly, why you want them to work in that way. This going back to this communication, etc. So, and the hierarchy of control is demonstrated there as an inverted triangle, primarily to say, you know, the most effective are the wide bits at the top. The best risk reduction method is elimination of the hazard and the risk, etc. So as you come down, the effectiveness gets reduced. So administrative controls are there, but if they're not done well and people don't engage with them and don't use them, they can be have limited effect. So it isn't necessarily about having loads of documents saying how everything should work and this, that, and the other, which is great, but it's no good. That in itself doesn't make an effective management system. The effective management system is where people use that information and work in that way as described. Then obviously the pinnacle, reverse pinnacle there at the bottom is PPE. The least effective control method is personal protective equipment, because it only protects that one individual. And if it isn't worn right, it's uncomfortable, all the things that we're now coming to the fore in the sort of viral conditions, etc. You know, it is the least effective method, but it's something that can be used to great effect if it's done well. So it's about having the right equipment, the right fit, appropriate equipment, etc. and the right controls for changing that, etc., as we've all come to see in recent weeks. Also within the planning elements of the standard in section 6 is looking about how are you going to achieve your objectives. You need to then identify some objectives. Does that create new risks? So objectives need to consider the strategic direction of the business and the organization. What does the organization need to do? What does it want to do? Does it want to increase in size? Does it want to stay the same size, etc.? All these things have an influence on risks and opportunities within the organization and have an impact on the risks and the opportunities of risk reduction in terms of the operations. Some of the operations may also have legal and mandatory requirements. Certainly within the UK, there's a range of legislation. If you do certain things, you've got to have this, you've got to have that. There's a legal framework that supports that type of operation, and you've got to be able to then understand those needs and requirements and deliver them effectively. Which also means checking to make sure you deliver them effectively. Just because you know there's a legal obligation for a statutory inspection if nobody checks that that statutory inspection has been undertaken, is that effective? It's about effectiveness of the management system throughout. And this is where your workers and at every level need to participate in this, because they're all there to help each other and help deliver an improved performance of the management standard. So actions in section 6, there's also an actions to address risks and opportunities. So hazard identification and assessment of risk and opportunities shall be maintained as documented information. So it doesn't say how to do a risk assessment, doesn't say whatever, but there must be evidence of that. Yeah. Also think about, you know, who participated in the risk assessment. Does that demonstrate that it was done by workers, or was it just done by one individual, etc.? Think about how you actually do risk assessments, because this engagement thing is core. Determination of legal and other requirements. So that also needs to be retained as documented information in some way, shape or form. So when we talk about documented information, it doesn't necessarily need to be in hard copy paper format. It could be electronic or whatever. Talk about that in a little more depth further into the webinar. But understanding what legal and other requirements the organisation must subscribe to is very important, and also understanding how then you deliver that. Like I say, knowing there's a statutory requirement for something doesn't necessarily mean you then deliver it. So the process is, what's the requirement? How do we deliver it? And further on in section 9 is reviewing performance and evaluation of compliance with that requirement. Yep, I can confirm we've done that because we've inspected records and etc., within the management system itself. But in section 6, it's purely about determination of what's required and how it applies to you is the critical element of section 6 in terms of legal and other requirements. Also in section 6 is the requirement to set objectives, and objectives should relate to risks and opportunities and strategic direction of the organisation. So for example, you know, if your risk assessments say you've got a high risk of fatality, etc., that should be a focus to reduce that risk, as opposed to we've got a frequent risk of, let's say, paper cuts. I'm not saying we should ignore the paper cuts, but your priority should always be based on risk, looking at the potential for fatality and the severity of the injury that's potentially incurred, whether that be a physical injury and or ill health. So OHS objectives need to be established. The slight difference here is you also need to demonstrate how you plan to achieve them, and it also defines what should be, how you're going to know what you're going to measure, etc. So you want to know what you're trying to do, how you're going to do it, and how do you know when it's going to be done, and how you're going to define the measurement. So as appropriate, you should look at all those elements within objectives and planning. But they need to be documented. They also need to be communicated to the relevant people. It's no point setting somebody an objective and then not telling them about it. The likelihood they won't achieve the objective if they don't know they have an objective to achieve. Coming back to engagement and communication. So it's really important that you look at the objectives, and it's about meaningful objectives, and it should be based on information as well as strategic requirements, but it should also be based on risks and opportunities that you've identified in the earlier part of section 6. So risk assessment, and hazard identification is a primary driver for the management system. If there's a policy change, for example, if there's a strategic change in the business, new risks could be introduced. How do you know they've been introduced if you don't assess the risks and the various things for new processes, etc., etc.? So risk assessment is really a primary driver for the organisation. In section 7, we're looking at the support functions. So looking at the resources, the information and training and competence for the management system. So under the resources, we're looking at the competence of human resource. So it applied to external workers as well as internal, which links to procurement. So before, when you're looking at a contractor, for example, and I'll use in the UK, a gas engineer. A gas engineer needs to have certain competencies before they're legally permitted to work on gas systems. If you engage a contractor as a gas engineer, you need to firstly check that they've got the requirements of that competence. So this is linking both the statutory obligation and the real world obligation of this person needs to be competent. Are you going to let anybody come and play with your gas system? I would hope the answer is no, you're not. So it depends on where you're geographically located. There can be statutory obligations that help you identify those requirements of competence, but you must understand it's your primary obligation to define your competence requirements. What do you want them to do? What do you need them to do? Is there a statutory obligation there? Ignorance is no defense when it comes to competence. And that process must be, it links in the standard under resources and procurement. Think about how would you demonstrate that? How do you know that they've got to be this or that? How does your system identify that for you? This is all part of the functioning of an effective management system throughout. Awareness, including the ability to remove themselves from situations, and this is a quote directly from the standard. So workers also have the ability to remove themselves from work situations that present an imminent and serious threat to life, and that's part of the culture of the organisation. So they need to be aware of that. Yep, if you think something's wrong, tell us, and they should be encouraged to do that. So this is all about how that communication process works. Do they know about that? Have they been trained? Would they be able to identify that as an imminent risk, etc.? So it's about understanding how people actually react and how people understand their working duties. So it's awareness of all these things. Communication, the clause was expanded to include the needs of internal and external communication, and some forms of communication will need to be retained as documented information. So work instructions, etc., etc., could be examples of retained as documented information. And also in section 7 is documentation and documented information itself. So documented information can be a range of media. It's not just talking about hard copy, paper-based information. It could be electronic, it could be training media, it could be, but it also needs to be suitably controlled. So the standard goes into a whole range of controls, and they're not new controls in any way, shape or form. Anybody familiar with management systems, version control, authorization of release, etc., etc. All these things are built in to a lot of management standards. But it can be very important in terms of OHS management systems about controlling the right level of information and communication. So this brings us to operational controls. Although in the standard it's a relatively short clause in terms of what's written, but this is the fundamental element. This is the core of the management system. Everything else you do should be about delivering safe and effective operational controls and practices for workers within the rest of the system. So although this is a relatively short clause in itself, this is the core of the management system in terms of what you're trying to deliver. So general requirements there, looking at including and maintaining documented information, work instructions, safe systems of work, risk assessments, method statements, etc., 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 and adapting work to workers as appropriate. It's about making the process safe for workers, not just about having, well, it's a very effective process, but if it kills 3 people every time you do it, that isn't an effective process in terms of occupational health and safety. This is about protecting people from workplace risk. The core of the standard looks at eliminating hazards and reducing risk overall. So elimination of hazards is the primary, most effective method of reducing risk. So that should be your starting point. Do we need to do that? Do we need to do it like that? Is there a better method? Can we adopt that better method, etc., etc.? That's the core. Management of change. I think realistically, certainly with the current crisis and various things going on, most businesses need to look at the management of change. Change isn't always foreseeable, but there may be some indicators there from a very early stage. I can see there's a change coming. Is the new technology? Is working practices changing? Is there a new threat, a new risk? How do we manage that? The management of change can even be as subtle as, well, an experienced worker is going on holiday. So we want to put a lesser experienced worker in a particular operation. Is that the right thing to do? Let's plan for the management of change and consider, should we give that potential holiday cover for that worker? Should we give them some training prior to, before that person goes on leave, before they have to undertake that? Should we give them some refresher training, etc.? These are the things that should be built into your management system as a matter of routine. You know, it's no good saying, oh, well, Charlie did that job 10 years ago. He'll be all right to step in. We appreciate sometimes it could be sickness or whatever, but you need to think about change, because change is happening all the time, at all levels within an organization. There are subtle changes. So think about that. Procurement now includes general procurement, contractors, and outsourcing requirements of operationals. As I say, a lot of organizations may not fundamentally undertake an operation directly themselves, but they may contract it out or outsource it. All these things now to be included, as they always have been, but it's been expanded and built upon in terms of requirements in operational control. Then in 8.2, we've got emergency preparedness and response. So some of this shall be retained as documented information. So what are your plans? People need, you know, what do people need to refer to? Is it known? Do they know where to find it? It's no good having the emergency, a fire evacuation plan. Oh yeah, it's all great. It's on somebody's desk. But nobody knew at 10 o'clock in the evening that it was on the desk. It needs to be accessible, it needs to be documented. People need to use it, need to know where it is. It needs to be kept up to date, and you need to learn lessons and reduce risk over time. So think about emergency preparedness and response. Only you can identify the primary emergencies that may apply to your operation. You know your business far better than us, assessors or whatever else. Use that knowledge. Think about what could go wrong. Have we got a plan for that? Some emergency preparedness is mandatory and statutory. Other, for the bulk of it, is applied common sense. We've got a history of that. We know about that. Have we learned the lessons? Did we put something in place? Do people know about it? It's about having an open and transparent culture within an organisation. If that goes wrong, think about this. These are the steps. Give people guidance and support. In section 9 of the standard, it's looking at performance evaluation. So having carried out all the activities in clause 8, which is the operational controls, it's time to monitor, measure, analyse and enhance performance. So this is why we say that the management system is not a reactive system. We're trying to foresee hazards before they happen and limit the impact. Occasionally, something happens that we didn't foresee, or a hazard develops that we haven't foreseen. So we also need to monitor, measure, and review performance to ensure that it's current and effective and it's working. So as an evaluation of compliance, for example, needs to be retained as documented information. What you're going to monitor and whatever needs to be demonstrated. And we need to be able to see evidence of that monitoring and measurement and various things and the analysis of performance. Show me the review meeting, show me the safety committee, show me this, show me the communication of that, show me the safe system of work or whatever. So there's things there, but how that's documented and controlled, think about it. Can you demonstrate that when an assessor asks? Also think within your organisation, more importantly than an assessor asking the question, if a worker asks the question, can you demonstrate what you need to do, what they need to do, what you're going to, why you look at this, what you're going to do? It's really important in terms of communication about monitoring and measuring and analysing performance to improve performance over time. There's a requirement within the standards for continual improvement. Evaluation of compliance refers to the legal and other requirements that we talked about earlier on. This is really important. It's no good assuming that because you know there's a legislation requirement and you know you've got operational controls or safe systems of work that you are compliant. How do you know that those safe systems of work are effective? So the evaluation of compliance against requirements is a critical element of control, and that needs to be documented. Internal audits. Generally, the requirements for internal audits hasn't significantly changed from 18,001. The requirements are still the same. There needs to be a program which needs to be documented. There also needs to be documented evidence of audits being conducted, etc., etc. Internal audits are a really important and powerful tool within the management standard. So you're looking at the reason you're doing internal audits is numerous. but potentially looking at it's a confirmation that the management system is delivering what you need it to deliver. And it's trying to confirm that your controls are effective. So when you're looking at your internal audit program, for example, use the information that the management system is generating. Oh, we've had a lot of accidents in a particular thing, or there's been really good performance in an area. So we can take a risk-based approach in terms of internal audits and saying, well, all our performance indicators are saying we've never had a problem in there. So, okay, we might look at that less frequently than the known areas that we do know there has been a problem. So yes, it's a bit reactive, but you should be using that information to help develop your management system into the continual improvement scenario. The management review, the wording has changed slightly in the management review, but primarily the fundamental requirements of management review haven't significantly changed. I would advise anybody when they're looking at implementing 45001 is to have a copy of the standard available to the people that are developing the system. Because if you don't know the rules by which you're playing the game, then how are you going to deliver those requirements? It's really important. A lot of organizations, we know what we're doing, we'll just do this. And then when we come and we go, well, clause XYZ says this, can you show that to me? They go, oh, didn't realize it said that. So it's really important because the management system is a proven, effective system. It works. And I think the migration to 45001 builds on the strong foundation that 18001 had in place, but it really is about making that effective and fit within the normal operations of an organization. Enhancement of OHS performance is a fundamental objective of the management system. So this is where in section 10, you need documented information about incidents and accidents and various things that have gone on, non-conformities and corrective and improvement actions that's taken. You need to understand, and that needs to be documented, not only for our benefit as an external assessment body coming in, but also for your own organization. You need to be able to say, well, this is what happened in that particular area or that particular instance. We've reviewed the risk assessment, we've done this, we've done that, we've done that. All these things need to be documented and retained within the management of incidents and non-conformity to deliver long-term corrective action and improvement. Continual improvement by enhancing and promoting a culture of support and worker participation, etc., is all there. It's all within section. If you're doing all the other sections effectively, then I would suggest you should naturally achieve continual improvement. I'm just looking at some of the questions now. So, system integration. I've been asked a question here, can you please give any hints on how we can combine three systems, 9014 and 45001? My colleague and I are doing a webinar on system integration and benefits of that on the 7th of May. So rather than going into great levels of detail, now, but because we're using the Annex SL framework across all the management standards, system integration and benefits of, there are common elements, management review, corrective actions, etc., can all be centralized. Legal and other requirements could be centralized, etc. There's also I had a question, when is the expiry date of 18,001? As I've said, that's the 30th of September 2021. That's at a 6-month extension. It was originally March, based on the publication of 45,001. It has been extended due to COVID concerns. All the slides and the presentations will be available from the website. Ask the question here is, how is NQA approaching auditing in terms of requirements of clause 5.4? Well, in terms of the leadership and all those things, we'll look at the management system, we'll look at all the various performance requirements, and we're looking at the system as a whole. Had a question, where's the best place to buy 45,001? My answer to that is NQA don't sell it, so it's not a sales pitch on behalf of NQA. It's basically available from ISO publications and other reputable retailers. So you can buy the standard directly from ISO there. So I don't think there's any further questions unless anybody's got anything burning issues there. There doesn't seem to be anything that's... So hopefully you found the webinar interesting. Obviously, I can't answer direct questions for particular organisations. We can only give you an overview of what the standard is looking for and clarify what the standard is trying to achieve. We're not consultants, we're not allowed to consult. I can't give you direct answers to specific questions about organisations, but there's a lot of commonality in terms of system integration that if you want to hear more on that, we've got a webinar on the 7th of May in relation to that. Right then, if that's it for everybody, I'll have a quick summary. So key points. If you're starting from scratch and you haven't got 18,001, have a copy of the standard available. Identify sources of legal compliance and other information, review of hazards. Review your existing systems. Look at your internal systems if you've got internal audits, and look at that. And if you're migrating, read the standard. NQA clients, we do a gap analysis for our clients, which you can complete internally, but we can also complete that service for you at a charge. We can also do a gap analysis for new incumbents to 45,001 as part of the registration service, but there is an additional charge to that. It's not part of your normal registration. Look at your internal audit systems, conduct your management reviews, have everything ready. Like I say, the revised date for the migration is now the 30th of September 2021. So that has had a just over 6 month extension from March. So I hope you found this webinar useful. Like I say, there's a lot of information available on our website, NQA website, gap analysis guides, etc., etc. Lots of information there. If nobody's got any more specific information or any specific questions, thank you for attending. I hope you found it useful. Like I say, I can't consult, we can't answer individual company specific questions, but we can clarify what the international standard is looking to achieve. And that's, we are here to help wherever we can. And if you need any more help or advice, firstly, visit our website and that should direct you to the support that you need. Thank you all very much. These slides and recordings will be sent out to you for those registered participants. And thank you very much for your time. And I'll see you next week sometime with myself and Richard doing a similar webinar on integration. Thank you.